You didn't choose your parents, at least not consciously. But what if I told you that, on a level beyond the rational mind, your soul already knew exactly where it wanted to be born, and to whom? And more, that this choice has nothing to do with comfort, love, or protection, but with something much deeper, stranger, and perhaps more risky than you ever imagined? For centuries, ancient teachings were silenced, labeled as superstition or spiritual heresy. But some fragments escaped, hidden in forgotten texts, whispered by mystics, and now echoing in discoveries of modern physics and subconscious neuroscience. They point to an unsettling secret. There is a moment between death and birth when the soul chooses. And that choice doesn't involve just the parents, but also the reunion with an old love, a soulmate with whom we made agreements lifetimes ago. What most people don't know is why that choice is made, and who is really making it. In what follows, you'll understand why you've never heard about this, and how this secret could change everything. No one talks about the exact moment when everything ends, and yet something continues. It's as if there's an unrecorded interval between death and rebirth, a blank space that doesn't belong to time as we know it. For most spiritual traditions, this instant is sacred. But to science, it's just meaningless silence. Is it though? Or is it possible that what exists in that space is precisely what gives meaning to everything that comes before and after? Ancient accounts speak of a crossing, but not like a journey. It's more like a bodiless awakening, where consciousness recognizes itself outside matter and sees for the first time what has always been behind the illusion. And at that point, they say, the spirit is faced with choices that no human logic can explain. Who you were, what you felt, who you hurt, and who you loved. All of it appears as living images, as if you were watching your own life projected in an invisible theater. It is in that in-between space that, according to certain esoteric traditions, the spirit begins to tune into new possibilities of existence. But these are not random choices. They follow a kind of inner vibration that seems to know your most hidden patterns, as if the soul itself were guided by something beyond will, a silent intelligence that doesn't think, it feels. But what is this force that guides? Where does it come from, and why does it know so much about us? Neuroscience in recent years has uncovered something disturbing. Moments before death, the brain enters an altered state of activity, almost as if it's picking up something beyond the body. Some scientists call this a neural farewell. Others quietly admit they have no explanation at all. And what if, in those moments, we're not just dying, but crossing into a subtler level of perception? What if that supposed blackout is actually a lucid transition we forget the moment we're born again? Interestingly, almost all ancient cultures have myths about this space. The Egyptians called it Duat. The Tibetans spoke of the Bardo. The Greeks believed in crossing the river Lethe. Why do so many traditions point to the same blind spot? And why do the accounts consistently say that there, the spirit reviews life and chooses the next step? There is something about that moment that seems to be more than just memory. It seems to be the origin of the next mission. But perhaps the most disturbing part is yet to come. What happens when a soul doesn't want to return? And more, what convinces it to choose rebirth? Why do some people enter your life as if they were returning from a forgotten place? As if the reunion had been scheduled long before either of you were born? Classical physics calls this coincidence, but quantum thinking, more and more, begins to admit that chance may just be the visible face of an invisible mechanism, a pattern that connects frequencies, not names. A code that organizes encounters, even if you never see it working. Some say that, between lives, the soul reconnects to this code, not like a map with streets and avenues, but as a geometry pulsing in vibrations. It's as if each choice vibrates, at a specific frequency, and you can only access a path if you're emitting the exact note. This could explain why certain situations repeat, even when you think you've moved past them. Maybe you're trying to exit a cycle using the wrong key, and you don't even know it. Science is still crawling through this territory. But research on morphogenetic fields, such as those proposed by Rupert Sheldrake, suggests that there are collective memories that shape the way organisms organize themselves. And what if this applies to the soul too? What if there are vibrational structures that attract specific parents, places, even names, all based on the subtle geometry of who you've been and what you need to experience now? Some ancient spiritualists believe that each soul has its own geometric pattern, a kind of energetic signature. That would determine where and with whom the soul can incarnate. It's not about preference, but about vibrational compatibility. Life, then, wouldn't be a lottery, but an equation. Except it's not a cold equation. It pulses, it feels, it adapts. And more, it can be altered if consciousness expands enough to interfere with the pattern. Think about it. Maybe there's no randomness in the moment you're born in a specific city, into a family with certain dynamics, surrounded by people who unknowingly trigger memories you chose to relive. These activations would be like combinations to a hidden vault within the soul, waiting for the right moment to open. But who programmed this vault? Who wrote this sequence? And more importantly, can it be broken? What happens when a soul tries to break that code? And is there something or someone trying to stop it? Imagine a library that doesn't contain books, but experiences. Not shelves of paper, but layers of consciousness, where everything you've ever lived, felt, and chosen is recorded. And not just that, also the paths that could have been. This place had many names in the past. The Hindus called it Akasha, the Greeks, anamnesis. Carl Jung suggested something similar when speaking of the collective unconscious. But what really exists in these records that no one can touch? Platonic philosophy describes a moment between lives when the soul, faced with imminent forgetfulness, chooses its next incarnation by observing possible lives like someone flipping through a book. Not with eyes, but with a clarity that transcends time and space. The soul sees where it failed, where it avoided, where it resisted, and chooses not the easiest path, but the most necessary one. Why? Because in that library, learning is the only enduring treasure. Nothing else carries over through the ages with you. In deep psychology, there are accounts of regressions in which patients access memories that don't belong to this life and describe, in detail, decisions made somewhere else, with other consciousnesses involved. Is this fantasy? Or are these memories windows into that hidden archive? Science can't prove it, but it also can't explain why so many accounts from different cultures match the same images. Rooms of light, spiritual councils, and a kind of agreement made before birth. What if you could remember your last visit to that library? Not with your rational mind, but with that strange feeling of déjà vu that's been with you since childhood. A place you've never seen, but know. A choice you don't understand, but feel is yours. Maybe that's what we call intuition, the echo of an ancient decision, still reverberating. Could it be that deep down, you already know why you're here and who you came to meet? Now think, if there really is a spiritual library with all possible paths, why do most of us repeat such similar patterns? Did we choose poorly? Or are we trapped in something we still don't understand? The feeling of déjà vu might be a clue, but it might also be a warning. What haven't you allowed yourself to remember? And more importantly, who or what is preventing you from accessing those records again? Before the first cry, before the first human touch, something was already sealed, not with ink nor with words, but with intention. Some spiritualist teachings call this a soul contract. It's not a document, but a silent agreement between consciousnesses, sealed on a plane where there is no paper, only purpose. And this contract, they say, defines not only the parents who will receive you, but also the challenges that will make you remember who you truly are. But who drafts this contract, and why must it be made in the complete anonymity of conscious life? Some mediums report that these agreements are made in the presence of spiritual guides, beings who act as soul advisors. Others suggest that the higher consciousness itself, the essential self, chooses the terms. Curiously, in all these narratives, suffering is not accidental. It's part of the plan, part of the pact. As if some pains were chosen even before we had a body to feel them. From a psychological perspective, there's something that resonates here. The theory of the life script, proposed by Eric Berne, suggests that decisions made in early childhood shape how we live, as if we're following a pre-written script. But what if this script is older than we think? What if, unconsciously, we're simply following agreements made before we even had a name? Could our parents be just the first characters in a carefully designed drama? There's an even more intriguing detail. These contracts don't involve only you. There are agreements between souls that reunite across different lifetimes to fulfill specific missions. Enemies, lovers, mentors, all are part of this invisible theater where the stage is earth and the plot is awakening. But what happens when one of the parties breaks the contract? When a father leaves, a mother wounds, a love walks away? Did the contract fail, or just change shape? Is it possible to renegotiate a soul contract? Some say yes, that through deep self-knowledge and the expansion of consciousness, new clauses can be added, new paths accessed. Others believe the agreement is unbreakable. But the lingering, disconcerting question is, do you really know with whom and with what you made this agreement? Or worse, do you even remember signing anything at all? There is a kind of meeting that doesn't require words. A look, a silence, a gesture, and something inside you seems to recognize what your mind has never lived. Many call this a soulmate, but does that word still carry its real meaning? Because, contrary to what common sense suggests, this meeting is rarely comfortable. It doesn't come to complete, it comes to confront, not to save, but to reveal. Various spiritual traditions suggest that soulmates are fragments of an original consciousness separated into multiple experiences to expand learning. But when they meet again, these parts don't simply embrace, they collide. Because spiritual recognition is visceral. It shatters defenses, unearths old memories, and awakens a feeling that defies all logic. How do you explain missing something? You haven't lived yet? Science, though skeptical of the term soulmate, is beginning to investigate the neurochemical effects of intense, immediate connections between people. Hormones like oxytocin and dopamine are explosively activated in such encounters, as if the body were responding to something much older than the present moment. Could the physical body also recognize spiritual contracts? Could there be memories not stored in the mind, but in the cells? Jung spoke of the concepts of anima and animus, inner archetypes we project onto those with whom we share intense bonds. For him, these encounters reveal parts of ourselves we haven't yet understood. But what if it's not just projection? What if those figures that appear in our lives actually carry fragments of ourselves? Fragments that, once in front of us, force us to face what we've avoided in every other relationship. That's why many soulmates don't stay together. Love exists, yes, but it serves a higher purpose, to activate what has lain dormant. Sometimes that means staying, other times leaving. The reunion, then, isn't a reward, it's a key. And every key only makes sense in front of a locked door. But what door is that? What lies on the other side? And what happens when the key appears? Before you're ready to use it, or maybe the soulmate only appears to prove that you're not ready yet? Who chooses for you before birth? The mind that doesn't yet exist? The soul which sees all? Or could it be the heart? Not the organ, but the intelligence that vibrates at the center of your being. Most spiritual traditions claim that the heart is more than a muscle. It's a center of consciousness. But science, interestingly, is starting to say the same. Recent studies show that the heart has its own electromagnetic field, thousands of times more powerful than that of the brain. What does that mean, exactly? It means the heart feels before the mind understands. It perceives before reasoning kicks in. And if that's true, could it be the heart that determines where the soul should return? Where it will be most touched, most challenged, most transformed? In many ancient cultures, the heart was the true organ of judgment. The Egyptians, for example, believed that the heart of the dead was weighed on a sacred scale. The brain was discarded. What does that tell us about the power of silent decisions? Mystics say the heart emits signals even during the between lives phase, signals that echo like subtle beats in the energetic field of the universe. These beats, then, would resonate with certain families, places, and stories. Could these be the first pulses of the next life? Quantum physics speaks of resonance. What if the choice of the next life happens through vibrational affinity, where the heart attracts what most aligns with your evolution? It's not hard to notice that even in this life, the heart seems to know. It tightens without reason, races without explanation, softens in certain encounters, and hardens in others, as if it remembers something the mind has erased. Maybe that's why, when we choose with the heart, we feel we're being loyal to something invisible. And when we ignore it, everything feels disconnected, without meaning, without root. But what if that feeling isn't emotional, but spiritual? The unsettling question is, to what extent does this heart intelligence operate before birth? Did it already know what you were coming to face? Did it agree to each loss, each pain, each bond that seemed random? And what if, deep down, it was the heart that brought you back to the exact place where something still needed to be lived? But what happens when the heart contradicts itself and wants to return to a place the soul has already tried to escape? Have you ever wondered why you were born into the exact family you were? Why those parents, that last name, that environment, and not any other? The most common answer is biological chance. But there's a disconcerting detail. Even in the most loving families, there's always a wound, a tension, a reflection. What does this reveal? That maybe parents aren't just caregivers, but mirrors that show, with brutal honesty, what the soul has not yet integrated. Carl Jung said, "What we deny in ourselves appears in our destiny as something inevitable." Our parents, then, could be the physical manifestation of these denied parts, traits that bother, hurt, or limit, because they show us exactly what we came to transform. There is no coincidence in the kind of relationship we have with them. There's a pattern, like a silent formula, that attracts not the ideal love, but the necessary challenge. A challenge we often only understand much later. Transgenerational. Psychology has already shown that unresolved traumas can repeat across generations. This is not metaphor, it's inherited information. But what if that inheritance isn't just genetic? What if it's energetic? What if the soul, when choosing its parents, is actually seeking to reconnect with those traumas, not to suffer, but to transform them? The home where you were born may not have been the most comfortable, but perhaps it was the most suited to your growth. In modern spirituality, there's a lot of talk about the soul family. But few remember that this doesn't always mean harmonious affinity. Sometimes it's precisely the ones who hurt us most who belong to that group, not because they want to destroy us, but because they agreed on the spiritual plane to play the role that would activate our greatest potential. That completely changes how we view pain. It is not punishment, it is a code. What if the parents you've criticized so much were, in fact, parts of an agreement made out of love? Not romantic love, but its rawest and most committed form. Love for truth. Truths that hurt, truths that liberate. And what if, by rejecting those reflections, we're actually postponing something we promised to face even before we were born? But the question few dare to ask is, what happens when the mirror breaks and you refuse to look at the shards? There are lives that never truly begin, hearts that beat for days, weeks, and then fall silent. For many, these are biological losses, tragic events with no greater purpose. But what if something more is going on? What if these brief existences aren't accidents, but deliberate choices made by the soul? Choices made in silence between the world of the living and the BT, world of those yet to come. Why would a soul choose to come, only to leave? Some traditions say there are souls that only need to touch matter for an instant, as if that brief contact alone fulfills a cycle. Spirits who incarnate for seconds, just to seal an energetic agreement, release a lineage, or offer deep learning to those who awaited them. Could these be the silent messengers? The ones who come not to live, but to remind? From the perspective of spiritual psychology, these experiences deeply impact the emotional field of the parents. There is an invisible reconfiguration of identity, a void that can't be explained, but transforms. What few realize is that, in that void, a new awareness is born, more attentive, more sensitive, more profound. What if that's exactly what the soul came to trigger? Not a presence, but an absence that awakens? Scientifically, little is still known about the causes of spontaneous pregnancy loss. But there's a growing consensus that even in those short periods, a connection already exists between mother and fetus that goes beyond the biological. There is a bond, a flow of emotional information that remains. This could indicate that despite its brevity, something was recorded, something was lived. But in what? Some spiritualists claim that these souls return later, in other bodies, in other families, sometimes even the same one. Others simply don't come back because they've already fulfilled what they needed to. This leads us to a disconcerting question. What defines whether a soul stays or backs out? What does it see on the other side that makes it change its mind? And even more disturbing, could some souls come only to test the doorway? But what happens when that test reveals it's not time yet? And the spirit, even without being born, has already transformed everything around it. Have you ever felt certain encounters were destined to happen? People who show up in your life at just the right moment, change everything, and sometimes vanish without explanation. The mind calls this coincidence, but what if it's much more than that? Nikola Tesla once said, "If you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." That statement, ignored for decades, is now resurfacing as a key to understanding why some meetings are inevitable. Quantum physics suggests that everything vibrates, not just atoms, but thoughts, emotions, intentions. And what if souls also have a unique vibration, like an energetic signature? That would explain why some encounters are so intense, even between strangers. Maybe they're not strangers. Maybe they've met before, in other bodies, in other lives, always drawn to the same frequency that insists on repeating itself. There are neuroscience studies showing how one person's electromagnetic field can directly influence another human body. Science calls it heart coherence. Spirituality calls it recognition. When two souls tune in, something happens before words, before reason, an activation. You feel it. You don't understand it, but you feel it. It's like something inside you realigns, like a dormant part of you has been touched. In Hindu tradition, this phenomenon is known as samskara, karmic impressions that cause souls to reunite. For some esoteric schools, these are ancient pacts that activate at the slightest vibrational proximity. That's why, sometimes, you meet someone by chance, But the connection is so strong, it feels like time bends. Like the clock stops and everything around you loses meaning for a few moments. That's when the invisible touches the real. But what no one talks about is this. These connections don't always come to stay. Some arrive only to realign, others to awaken something long buried. They don't follow human rules of permanence or comfort. They follow something greater, something that vibrates beyond ordinary comprehension. And when that vibration fades, there's no use in forcing it. The lesson was delivered. The frequency has already changed, but the question still lingers. Who or what decides when those vibrations align? And the most disturbing of all, could some encounters have been arranged long before time began to count? Who, in their right mind, would choose to suffer? Who would look at a life of loss, abandonment, abuse, or loneliness and say, yes, that's where I want to go? The instinctive answer is no one. But what if the soul knows something we forget the moment we are born? What if for the soul, pain isn't punishment, but a tool? A surgical instrument, precise, that cuts away everything that prevents true growth. Could that be the most courageous and most misunderstood form of love? In many near-death experiences, people describe reviewing their lives and suddenly understanding with devastating clarity why certain pains happened. They feel love, even for those who hurt them. How is that possible? Maybe because, outside, the body, the soul sees the entire board. It understands the moves, recognizes the agreements. And then, suffering gains context. It was necessary. It was chosen. Not as punishment, but as a catalyst. Deep psychology teaches us that the greatest traumas often carry, paradoxically, the greatest potential for transformation. Jung said, where there is a wound, there is healing. But what if that wound isn't just the result of an emotional accident? What if it's the doorway the soul knew it would need to walk through in order to remember its own strength? That changes everything. Pain stops being a random burden and becomes a code, which, if deciphered, reveals a secret path of evolution. And there's an even more delicate point. Some souls seem to choose extremely difficult lives from the very beginning. Abusive parents, extreme poverty, early losses. Is that masochism? Or is it pure spiritual courage? Ancient texts speak of missionary spirits, beings who agree to incarnate in extreme circumstances to break deep-rooted patterns, whether on a personal, familial, or collective level. But what if that mission is forgotten? What remains then is just pain or emptiness. Spiritually, it's believed that the soul doesn't choose pain for the suffering itself, but for the transformation it brings. Fire that burns also purifies. But that's a truth only revealed at the end, never at the start. In the beginning, everything seems unfair, cruel, meaningless. The soul, however, already knew. It didn't come here to have an easy life. It came to break a cycle. And for that, sometimes, love must wear the mask of challenge. But what happens when the pain becomes so intense that the soul starts to forget why it chose to feel it? And who, or what, helps it remember before it's too late? How many times has something unlikely happened to you, and you just said, "What a coincidence"? A song that plays the moment you were thinking. About someone, a book that shows up out of nowhere and answers a question you hadn't even said out loud. Coincidences that seem to be watching you. Carl Jung gave this a name, synchronicity, but he warned, these meaningful coincidences are not random. They are messages, and like all messages, they only reach those willing to listen. Jung believed, synchronicity is how the unconscious manifests in the external world, a reflection between what's happening inside and what's unfolding outside. But what if it's not just the personal unconscious? What if they're clues planted by the soul itself before incarnation as reminders of a greater plan? As if each sign were a vibrational breadcrumb left along the path, so you wouldn't get completely lost while crossing the veil of forgetfulness. Science still doesn't understand this phenomenon, but it's beginning to explore how consciousness may influence the behavior of reality. Particle physics research shows that the observer affects the outcome. That means your attention alters what you see. But what if it's more than seeing? What if it's feeling that something is being revealed right then and there, as if the universe were winking at you? A living code, shaped by your own inner frequency. Synchronicities often occur at the most fragile or decisive moments of life: a loss, a rupture, an existential crisis. As if chaos were actually the fertile ground where clues finally sprout. Perhaps because, in those moments, you're more vulnerable, but also more open, less distracted by control, more willing to perceive. And it's precisely then that the signs appear, not as ready-made answers, but as arrows pointing to an invisible direction. Mystics say that the more aligned your life is with the soul's plan, the more frequent these coincidences become. And the more you ignore them, the more intense and unsettling the signs get. It's as if the universe is shouting for you to remember. Remember what you promised, what you agreed to live, what you chose to face. And what if every synchronicity is actually a whisper from your deepest self, trying to guide you back to the path? But what happens when these signs become so clear, so persistent, that ignoring them starts to cost too much? Who or what is speaking through them? And what might happen if you don't listen? Have you ever wondered why we don't remember who we were before we were born? Why there's this absolute silence about everything that came before, even though so many people feel like something was left behind? Birth is more than just a physical transition. It's a crossing of a threshold that erases memories, voices, pacts, and throws us into a world that seems new but holds old commitments. This forgetting isn't a flaw. On the contrary, it seems to be an essential part of the game. Various spiritual traditions speak of the veil of forgetfulness, an energetic field that blocks access to spiritual memories so the human experience can be real, raw, and authentic. Because knowing too much would make us spectators of our own lives. But some say not everyone forgets completely. Some children speak of past lives with unsettling ease. Others have fears or talents that can't be explained by any current experience. Could these be cracks in the veil? Neuroscience acknowledges that human memory is deeply shaped by the early years of life. But it also admits it cannot explain why we forget birth, the womb, or our first traces of awareness. What if this information isn't lost, but simply stored in a place the conscious mind can't access? The collective unconscious, maybe? Or something deeper still, the soul's memory. Mystics and regression researchers claim it's possible to access these memories through altered states of consciousness, deep meditation, hypnosis, or near-death experiences. In those accounts, what appears isn't just symbolic. They're vivid images, ancient emotions, decisions made before birth, as if the soul had left breadcrumbs, fragments of a story waiting to be reclaimed. But only when we're ready. But why would forgetting be necessary? Maybe because suffering without knowing why creates real growth. Maybe because having the answers too soon would cancel out genuine choice. The soul knows, but the body must relearn. Forgetting, then, would be an opportunity, the chance to love without guarantees, to seek without maps, to trust without proof. True awakening is only possible when there is something to awaken from. But what happens when the veil begins to falter? When dreams bring clues, when déjà vu become more frequent, when intuition intensifies? Could it be that we're beginning to remember what we were never supposed to forget? Some dreams come just once and vanish with the sunrise, but others linger. They repeat scenes, voices, faces, as if something in them remains unresolved, as if they're not exactly dreams, but messages. fragments of a place we can't name, visiting us at night like notes slipped under the door of consciousness. And what if these recurring dreams are pieces of another reality? An echo of what happened before we were born? Traditional psychology interprets dreams as expressions of the personal unconscious. But when the same dream repeats for years, even with subtle variations, something more seems to be at play. Some people dream of cities they've never seen, languages they've never studied, feelings they can't explain. And the strangest part, they wake up with a sense of belonging, as if they'd returned from a place too familiar to be fiction. In spirituality, some believe dreams are bridges between realms, that during sleep, the spirit partially detaches from the body and returns to higher levels of reality, including the so-called between lives plane, where souls rest and plan. If so, recurring dreams could be fragments of those visits, scenes the soul insists on showing, even if the limited mind can't understand why. Some regression researchers say many patients begin remembering past lives through recurring dreams. Symbolic images, but loaded with intense emotion, the kind of emotion the brain cannot fabricate. These aren't made-up stories. They're felt, lived, but forgotten. Or maybe just pushed aside by the veil we spoke of earlier. What if the dream is the crack through which the truth begins to leak? Jung saw dreams as portals to the self, the core of the soul. He said the most intense dreams were always attempts at reconnection. With what? With what was lost. With what we were. With what we still need to remember to move forward. Perhaps repeating dreams aren't asking you to understand. Perhaps they're asking you to feel, to recognize in silence something you yourself, marked as a reminder. But what happens when the same dream keeps coming back, and you start to realize it's not just about the past? What if it's a warning about what's still to come? Forget the image of a heavenly courtroom with angels, golden thrones, and eternal verdicts. What if, at the end of life, there's no one there to judge you, except yourself, not with guilt, not with punishment, but with eyes that see everything, without filters, without excuses, without masks? A silent judgment carried out by a consciousness that forgets nothing, not what you did, nor what you failed to do. What would it be like to face yourself with that level of total clarity? Accounts of near-death experiences from around the world coincide in one curious detail. Upon dying, the person reviews their life. Not like an ordinary movie, but feeling everything, not just what they did, but the impact they had on others. It's a life review felt on multiple levels. And the most unsettling part, there are no accusers, no punishment. Just the truth, pure and raw, seen through the soul's own eyes. What does that say about spiritual justice? Some esoteric traditions teach that in this moment, the consciousness aligns with its highest version, a kind of greater self that's always been silently observing. What if this self is, in fact, the architect of your journey, the voice that guided your noblest instincts, the force that felt every choice, even when you thought you were alone? That encounter would be a reunion with your essence. But what happens when you realize you haven't been true to it? Eastern philosophy speaks of karma not as punishment, but as balance. Everything we generate returns. But it returns not by external imposition. It returns because the soul wants to make it right. It seeks to complete cycles, harmonize frequencies, restore what was broken. That's why, after this silent judgment, the need to start over arises. The soul isn't forced to return. It wants to. It understands. And it accepts, even knowing that the next body will bring new challenges. What if it's that review moment that determines the next life? Not as a sentence, but as a commitment, an intimate promise. The soul recognizes where it failed, where it got lost, where it shone. And then it chooses. It chooses what it needs to live, what it needs to face, what it needs to remember. All of this before even being reborn. Spiritual responsibility in that sense is immense, because everything is seen, nothing is forgotten, nothing is denied. But what happens when the soul doesn't accept what it sees? When it refuses to continue, who or what can convince it to try again? And what if all of this soul, contracts, conscious choices, karmic reunions, trials of love and pain, was only part of a deeper game, an illusion carefully constructed to keep us busy while we forget what really matters? The question is scary, but pulses strongly in ancient traditions like Vedanta, which states, "There is no birth, no death, only appearance." If that's true, then what are we even trying to resolve here? Maybe the soul doesn't need to choose parents, partners, or destinies because, ultimately, none of this is real the way we believe. And what if all these decisions are just projections of the divine mind, simulating movement in a reality that is, at its core, unmoving? Time, space, pain, learning. Could they all be reflections of a consciousness playing at forgetting itself in order to remember again? Like a wave that forgets it is the ocean. Modern physics is beginning to admit that the observable universe may be a holographic projection, an informational field where what we perceive as matter is only organized perception. If that applies to the cosmos, why wouldn't it apply to the soul? And what if birth and death are just shifts in perspective within a single consciousness that was never truly separate, that never needed to be found, because it was never lost? Mystics like Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj said that true enlightenment isn't about understanding the cycle of reincarnations, but realizing that it never existed, that the individual soul is a useful fiction, a disguise used by absolute consciousness to experience itself. If that's the case, what we call choice is merely the reflection of a primordial will, so ancient and vast that it cannot be located within any personal self. But if none of this is real, in the absolute sense, why do we feel so much? Why do loss, reunions, fears, and hopes hurt? Perhaps because the illusion is necessary for the experience to feel real. Because only then can consciousness play at being human, and only then at some point can it awaken. The paradox is cruel and beautiful. Maybe the suffering you're trying to understand never truly existed, but the transformation it brings, that yes is real. So in the end, one question remains, a question no master dares to fully answer. If everything is an illusion, why do we keep feeling as if it were true? And if it's just a dream? Who's about to wake up? There's a question few people dare to ask. Does the soul truly choose alone? Or is there something or someone guiding the process, like a silent advisor, a hidden intelligence that whispers possibilities, points out risks, and keeps the boundaries of the plan in place? In many ancient traditions, this being was described with reverence. The Egyptians spoke of Thoth, the scribe of destinies. The Greeks mentioned Hermes, the messenger between worlds. In modern esoteric teachings, this entity is simply called a guide. But what or who are these spiritual guides? Could they be older consciousnesses that have already completed their incarnation cycles and now act as mentors? Or are they projections of the soul itself on higher levels of reality, parts of the self that remain lucid while the incarnated fragment forgets? Science has no answer, but quantum physics already acknowledges the possibility of multiple versions of the same being coexisting in distinct states of reality. And what if, between lives, we are in direct contact with these versions? Reports from people under deep hypnosis, like in the research of Dr. Michael Newton, describe encounters with spiritual councils, beings who help review past lives and plan the next one. In those encounters, there is exchange, analysis, silence. But most of all, there is guidance, as if the soul were under observation, not by a judge, but by a broader consciousness helping to fine-tune its path. And what if the choice of parents, of the soulmate, of the place and time, is made under this invisible supervision? Some say that this guide doesn't just advise, it sometimes insists that it may try to convince the soul to face challenges it hesitates to accept, because it sees further, because it perceives the threads connecting each choice to the other souls involved. What if the role of this being is to make sure you don't run from what you came to transform, to ensure you don't hide in spiritual comfort zones? That would completely change our idea of free will between lives. But there's something even more unsettling. What if not all guides are benevolent? What if there are interferences, consciousnesses that also compete to influence fragile, lost, confused souls? The Gnostic tradition spoke of the archons, subtle beings that interfere in the cycles of incarnation. What if a wrong choice isn't a mistake, but a suggestion you accepted without realizing where it came from? And even more disturbing, if there is a consciousness standing between you and your next life. How can you know if it's guiding you or misleading you?